The gavel came down like a gunshot. Sold to the Harding Cattle Company for $140. Isaac Aldridge stood at the back of the auction yard, his hat pressed flat against his chest, his knuckles white around the brim. He watched them lead Titan away through the dust, and the noise and the indifferent crowd, and something inside him cracked open so quietly that no one around him could have possibly heard it. The great red bull, massive and magnificent, ears twitching at the unfamiliar hands on his lead rope, turned his enormous head back once as if he knew. As if he understood what had just been traded away and why. Isaac did not look away. He owed the animal that much, $140. Every cent of it already spoken for. Already tucked inside the sealed envelope, he would deliver this afternoon to a man he despised more than any person living. The amount that equaled the full and complete debt of the Zavala family farm. The amount that would keep Violet Zavala's mother and younger brother from being thrown into the street by the end of the week. He had not told Violet. That was the part that made his chest feel like it was being hollowed out with a dull blade. She did not know. She could not know, because if she knew, she would refuse it, and if she refused it, he would lose her entirely. And losing her entirely would be worse than losing Titan. Worse than losing the last great prize of 3 years of careful breeding and patient labor. Worse than losing the future he had spent those same 3 years building toward in slow, methodical, lonely silence. He had told himself he could carry this secret. He had told himself it was the right thing, the clean thing, the kind thing. He had told himself these things so many times in the last 4 days that he had nearly believed them. He did not believe them now, because across the yard, through the swirling dust, he could see her. Violet Zavala, 22 years old and more beautiful than anything the Arizona Territory had ever produced, was walking toward the auction fence with her dark eyes wide and her face the color of chalk. She had seen Titan being led away. She had recognized the bull. And now she was looking at Isaac with an expression he had no armor against. She knew. She had figured it out somehow, the way she always figured things out, with that quiet, devastating intelligence she kept tucked behind her gentle manner. And she knew exactly what he had done and exactly why he had done it. And the look on her face was not gratitude, and it was not warmth, and it was not the relief he had foolishly imagined. It was something far more complicated and far more dangerous. It was the look of a woman who had just realized she owed a debt she had never agreed to carry. Violet Zavala had not cried in front of another person in 4 years, not since her father's funeral, not since she had stood at that rain-soaked graveside and decided that she was the oldest child and her mother needed steadiness more than she needed a daughter who fell apart. She had buried grief the way the desert buried everything, under layers of dry silence, under the flat, unyielding surface of getting through each day. She cried now. She did not mean to. She stood at the fence of the Tucson livestock yard on the 8th of October, 1882, with the afternoon sun blazing white and merciless overhead, and she felt the tears come before she could stop them, hot and sudden and furious. She was not crying because she was sad. She was crying because she was angry, and because she was grateful, and because those two things together were more than her composure could contain, and because Isaac Aldridge was walking toward her with his hat still pressed to his chest, and his jaw set in that expression she knew so well, the expression that said he had already made the decision and was prepared to defend it and would not apologize for it, and she did not know whether to embrace him or rage at him. She had come to the auction to find him. She had heard from her neighbor, old Mrs. Cortez, that someone had registered Titan for the fall sale, and she had known instantly, with a cold, sinking certainty, who had done it and why. She had ridden the 7 miles into Tucson on her mother's old mare, pushing the animal harder than was kind, telling herself she would arrive in time to stop it. She had not arrived in time. 3 weeks. That was how long she had known Isaac Aldridge, which was simultaneously not very long at all and long enough for everything to have changed. She had met him on the 17th of September. She could place the date exactly because it was the same day she had received the letter from the bank. The letter from Mr. Cornelius Fitch of the First Territorial Bank of Tucson, informing her that the mortgage arrears on the Zavala property, accumulating over the 14 months since her father's death, had reached a figure the bank could no longer overlook, and that unless the full amount of $140 was paid by the 15th of October, the property would be subject to foreclosure proceedings. $140. Her father had borrowed against the farm twice, once to survive a drought year and once to buy seed after a failed harvest. He had died before he could pay it back. The debt had transferred to the estate, which meant to her mother, Rosa Zavala, 51 years old and worn down by grief and hard work, and the particular exhaustion of being a Mexican woman trying to hold on to land in the Arizona Territory in 1882. Land that people with money and influence and Anglo surnames had been eyeing since before her husband was cold in the ground. She had been sitting there still when she heard the sound of a horse on the road and looked up and saw a tall man on a bay gelding slowing down in front of her fence. He was not the most remarkable-looking man she had ever seen. He was lean and weather-beaten in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, somewhere in his late 20s or early 30s, with dark sun-streaked hair and very steady gray eyes, and the kind of quietness that came from living alone. He wore a plain blue cotton shirt and worn dungarees, and a hat that had seen considerable weather. He was leading a second horse loaded with supplies. He had pulled up because his lead rope had snagged on her fence post, which had a loose nail sticking out of it at exactly the wrong angle. He was trying to work it free without dismounting. She had folded the bank letter into her apron pocket and gone to help him. "That nail has been catching on things since spring," she said. "I keep meaning to hammer it back." He had looked down at her with those steady gray eyes and said, "I appreciate the warning about 3 seconds too late." It was not a remarkable thing to say. It was a dry, quiet observation with no particular warmth to it. But she had laughed because there was something honest about it, something unadorned, and she had needed honesty that morning more than she had needed comfort. His name was Isaac Aldridge. He had a small cattle operation 7 miles northwest of Tucson, which she had not known about because she had spent the last 14 months with her head down trying to survive, and had not been paying much attention to her neighbors. He had bought the property 2 years earlier from a man who had given up and gone back east, and he had been building it up slowly, quietly, by himself. He raised cattle, and as she learned later, had spent considerable time and expense acquiring and developing a breeding bull of exceptional quality, whose offspring commanded premium prices. He had said very little while she untangled his rope. He had thanked her and ridden on. She had not thought much about it until 4 days later, when he appeared at her door with a bucket of milk and a ham wrapped in brown paper, and a completely transparent excuse about having excess from his stores. Her mother had accepted these things with the gracious formality she deployed when she suspected charity and did not want to shame the person offering it. Violet had walked him back to his horse and said directly, "You do not have to do this." He had looked at her for a moment with those steady eyes and said, "I know." He had come back the following week with fence-mending supplies, claiming he had extra cedar posts and wire and would use them rather than store them. Her brother Marco had worked alongside him for 2 days, replacing the failing sections of fencing along the south pasture. Isaac had talked to Marco easily and without condescension, the way some men could not manage, and she had watched from the kitchen window with something warm and guarded stirring in her chest. On the third visit, he had brought himself and nothing else, and asked if she wanted to walk the property line, because he had noticed what looked like water damage near the eastern boundary and thought she should know about it. They had walked for an hour and a half through the dry October afternoon, talking about the land and the irrigation and the prospects for the spring planting and the general situation of things. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, she had told him about the bank letter. She had not intended to. It had simply come out, the way things come out when you have been carrying them alone for too long and suddenly find yourself in the company of someone who listens without comment and without calculation. He had not offered to help. He had simply said, "That is a difficult position," and she had appreciated his restraint and the fact that he did not immediately begin suggesting solutions as though she were incapable of understanding her own problem. They had stood at the eastern fence line in the late afternoon light, looking out at the pale desert, and she had felt something shift in her understanding of herself and of loneliness, which she had been living with for so long that she had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a scar. She had not let herself think about what that meant. There was no room for it. There was the debt and the farm and her mother and Marco, and the relentless forward motion of keeping everything from collapsing. She could not afford the luxury of feelings about a quiet man with steady eyes who mended her fences. But something had happened to her anyway, in the way of things that happen without your permission. And on the evening of the fourth visit, when he had lingered past supper and helped her mother wash the dishes while Marco played music on the porch, and the stars came out over the desert in their extraordinary numbers, she had stood beside him at the wash basin and felt his shoulder against hers and thought, quietly and completely, that she was in serious trouble. He had left before full dark. He always left before full dark, with a kind of deliberate propriety that she recognized as both consideration and longing, because she felt the same thing herself. The wanting to stay, and the sense that staying too long too soon, was a kind of recklessness neither of them could afford. She had told herself, going to bed that night, that none of this could go anywhere while the debt hung over everything, that she could not enter into anything new while carrying the weight of the old. That Isaac Aldridge deserved better than a woman whose family might be dispossessed in a matter of weeks. She had not expected him to remove the obstacle himself. She had not imagined, for a single moment, that he would trade the thing he had spent 3 years building in order to save the thing she was terrified of losing. And now, he was standing in front of her in the dusty auction yard with the afternoon blazing around them, and she was crying in a way she had not planned, and he was looking at her with an expression that she could only describe as terrified, which was not an expression she had ever expected to see on his face, and she did not know where to begin. "You had no right," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "No," he agreed, "I did not. That bull was everything you had worked toward for 3 years. I know what Titan was worth to your operation. I know what it meant to lose him." "Yes," he said. "Then why?" She wiped her face with the back of her hand, furious at herself for the tears and unwilling to hide them. "Why would you do something like that without asking me?" Isaac looked at her for a long moment. The noise of the auction yard went on around them, the calling of prices and the movement of animals and the indifferent business of the world, and none of it touched the small space between them. "Because you would have said no," he said. "Of course I would have said no." "That is my family's problem to solve, Isaac, not yours. I know that." "Then why?" "Because I could not watch you lose that farm." His voice was quiet. It did not rise. He was not a man who raised his voice to make his meaning felt, and that made his meaning feel more when it came. I could not stand by and let that happen when I had the means to prevent it. That is a failing in me, maybe. A trespass against your independence. I am willing to own that, but I am not willing to say I was wrong to do it. Violet stared at him. The sun was brutal. The dust was everywhere. Titan was gone, led away by strangers into a future that did not include this yard or this man, and $140 was sitting in an envelope somewhere. And the Zavala family mortgage was about to be settled, and none of it made any sense as an act of casual neighborly goodwill. "Isaac," she said carefully. "What is this?" He held her gaze. His hat was still pressed against his chest. His gray eyes were steady and direct, and contained something she had been watching build for 3 weeks, something she had been pretending not to notice, because noticing it required her to act on it or refuse it, and she had been too overwhelmed to do either. "You know what it is," he said. She did know. She had known for at least 10 days, maybe longer. "That is a very large gesture," she said. "For something that has not been said, I know. You could have said it first." He looked down briefly at his hat, and she saw the ghost of something in his expression that might have been the closest Isaac Aldridge ever came to being flustered. "I was working up to it," he said. Despite everything, despite the dust and the tears and the magnitude of what he had just done, she felt something that was not quite a laugh but was close to one move through her chest. "You mended my fences and brought me ham," she said. "That was working up to it," slowly, he said. "Yes." She looked at him. This man who had lived alone for 2 years in the Arizona desert, by choice and necessity, who had built something from nothing with his hands and his patience, who had traded the finest thing he owned to clear a debt that did not belong to him. She looked at all of that, and she felt the full, complicated weight of it, the gratitude and the anger and the something beneath both of those, the something she had been carefully not naming. "You are going to tell me," she said, "exactly what you did and when you decided it, and I am going to be very angry at you for a while, and then we are going to talk about what happens next. Is that understood?" The thing in his expression shifted, and for the first time since she had arrived in this yard, something in his face relaxed fractionally. "Understood," he said. They did not talk in the auction yard. Too much dust, too many people, too much noise for a conversation that required the kind of quiet they both needed. Isaac retrieved his horse from the hitching post, and they walked together through the outskirts of Tucson toward the western edge of town, where the buildings thinned out and the desert began again, and there was a low stone wall that had once been part of someone's abandoned foundation, now good for nothing except sitting on and talking. Violet had left her mother's mare at the livery. She would need to collect her before dark. There were perhaps 2 hours of useful light left. She sat on the stone wall and he sat beside her, not quite touching, with the desert spreading out before them in its late afternoon colors, all copper and gold and the pale ghostly green of the scrubland. She had always loved this hour. Even now, even in the middle of everything, she could not help noticing it. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He had been at her farm on the 1st of October, helping Marco repair a section of the roof that had been damaged in a summer storm, when he had overheard Rosa Zavala speaking with Mrs. Cortez in the kitchen. Rosa had not known he could hear. She had been talking about the bank letter, about Cornelius Fitch, about the 15th of October deadline. She had been crying quietly, the way women cry when they are trying not to be heard crying, and she had said to Mrs. Cortez that she did not know what she was going to do, that she did not see a way through, that she could not ask her daughter to carry any more of this. Isaac had heard all of it. He had not said anything that day. He had finished the roof repair and eaten supper with the family and ridden home in the dark and lain awake for most of the night doing arithmetic. Titan was his most valuable asset by a significant margin. The bull had won 2 regional competitions. His offspring had sold for premium prices at the last 2 Tucson auctions. He had been approached several times by larger ranching operations about purchasing the animal and had always declined. Titan represented the future of his operation, the next 5 years at minimum of building toward something substantial. Selling him would not destroy that future. It would set it back significantly. He would have to rebuild the breeding program from a lesser animal or hire the services of another rancher's bull. But he could do it. It would take longer and it would be harder, and he would feel the loss in ways both practical and personal. Because Titan was an animal he had genuine affection for, which he did not say aloud because men in 1882, Arizona, did not generally discuss their affection for livestock. He had spent 3 days making himself consider all of this with full honesty. He had interrogated his own motives with a rigor that left him exhausted. Was this a genuine act of generosity toward a family in need? Was it an attempt to obligate Violet to him in some way? Was it something in between, something he could not comfortably name? He had decided, finally, that his reasons were complicated and that he was going to do it anyway. That the complexity of his feelings did not make the action wrong. That a family was about to lose their home, and he had the means to prevent it. And the fact that he was in love with the oldest daughter did not negate the basic humanity of the thing. He had registered Titan for the October auction on the 4th. He had asked the auction registrar to keep the seller's name out of the listing, which was an unusual request, but not an impossible one. He had delivered the sealed envelope with the proceeds to the First Territorial Bank of Tucson this morning, 2 hours before the auction began, with instructions to apply the full amount to the Zavala mortgage arrears. He looked at Violet while he told her this. He did not look away or soften anything. He told her the whole thing plainly and waited. She was quiet for a long moment after he finished. "My mother was crying," she said, "and you heard it." "Yes. And that was what decided you." He considered this. "I think I had already been moving toward it," he said. "That was what closed the door." Violet looked out at the desert. A hawk was making slow circles over something in the scrubland, patient and precise. She watched it for a moment. "Cornelius Fitch has been trying to buy our property for 8 months," she said. "Since the spring. He has made offers through intermediaries, small ones, insultingly small. My mother refused everyone. He is not just a banker to us. He is a man who wants our land and has been patient about getting it one way or another." She paused. "When I say you settled the mortgage this morning, you understand what else you did." "I understand that I removed his primary mechanism for forcing a sale," Isaac said. "Yes." She turned to look at him directly. "He is not going to like that. No, I expect he is not. He has influence in this town and resources, and he is the kind of man who does not accept obstruction gracefully." "I have dealt with men like that before," Isaac said. "In the territory that can mean things beyond legal complications." "I know." She studied him, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for the signs of a man who had not thought through what he was walking into. She found none. What she found instead was exactly the quality she had been noticing and cataloging over 3 weeks of careful observation. A stillness that was not passivity. A quietness that was not absence. A man who moved slowly and thought carefully, and when he decided something, stayed decided. "Isaac," she said, "I need to ask you something directly." "All right." "Are you doing this because you want something from me?" The question hung between them. It was a necessary question. It was also, she knew, A question that could break something if the answer was wrong, or break something different if the answer was right. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of formulating a calculated response, but the silence of a man who takes questions seriously enough to answer them honestly. "I am doing this because a family needs help, and I have the means to provide it," he said. "That is true. What is also true is that I have feelings for you that I have not expressed, and that I did not act on. I want to be clear about both of those things because I think you deserve the clarity. But I want you to understand that one is not the price of the other. I am not trading Titan for your affection. That is not something I am capable of doing and remaining a person I can respect." She looked at him for a long time. "That is exactly what I needed to hear," she said, "and I believe you." The hawk found what it had been looking for and dropped out of its circle and disappeared into the scrubland. The light was going golden and horizontal, the desert hour she loved. "For what it is worth," she said more quietly, "the feelings are not one-directional." Something changed in his face. Not dramatically. Isaac Aldridge was not a dramatic man. But something shifted in those steady gray eyes, something that she recognized as relief and tenderness, and the particular vulnerability of a person who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been given permission to put it down. "I appreciate hearing that," he said. She laughed then, properly, a full, warm sound that startled them both. "You appreciate hearing that," she repeated. "You trade your bull and I tell you I have feelings for you and you appreciate hearing it." "I am not eloquent," he said, and the corner of his mouth turned upward slightly. "No," she agreed, "but you are honest. I find that considerably more useful." They sat there as the light continued to gold and deepen around them, and she was aware of the warmth of him beside her, and the sound of the desert settling into evening, and the strange, peaceful weight of something having shifted, something having been named, the secret structure of the last 3 weeks made suddenly and irrevocably visible. "I need to get back," she said eventually. "My mother will worry, and I need to tell her about the bank. She does not know yet." "How do you think she will take it?" Violet considered this. "She will cry," she said. "And then she will want to know everything about you, every detail. She will ask how old you are and where your family is from and whether you have land in your name and whether you attend church. She is very thorough." "I am 29, he said. "My family is from Missouri. I have 40 acres in my name currently. And I attend church on the important occasions, and not as regularly as I probably should. That will concern her only slightly. I can work on the church attendance." She stood and smoothed her skirt and looked down at him with the evening sky behind her and felt, for the first time in 14 months, something unclenching somewhere deep in her chest. Not everything was solved. Fitch was still out there. The farm still needed work. The future was still uncertain in all the ways that futures in the Arizona Territory were uncertain in 1882. But something had been decided, some direction had been chosen, and she felt the solid ground of it beneath her. "Come to supper Sunday," she said. "I will tell my mother you are coming." He stood and settled his hat back onto his head and looked at her with that expression she was beginning to be able to read, the contained warmth of it, the careful restraint. "I will be there," he said. She collected the mare and rode home through the deepening dusk with the desert on all sides and the sky going dark blue and the first stars coming out, and she tried to organize her thoughts before she arrived and found she could not. Some things were beyond organization. Some things had to simply be experienced. Her mother was on the porch when she rode in, sitting in the ladder back chair with her mending in her lap, and the kerosene lamp lit against the gathering dark. Rosa Zavala was a small woman who had been made compact and resilient by a difficult life. with silver-threaded black hair and dark eyes that missed nothing, and a dignity that no amount of difficulty had managed to erode. She had raised her children with equal measures of warmth and expectation, and she looked at her daughter now with the expression that said she had been waiting and worrying but was not going to say so. "You are late," she said. "I know." Violet dismounted and tied the mare and climbed the 3 porch steps. "I need to tell you something." Rosa set down the mending. Her face went carefully still the way it went when she was preparing for bad news. "The debt," Violet said. "The bank. It has been paid." Rosa stared at her. "Paid," she repeated. "What do you mean paid? By whom?" "By a man named Isaac Aldridge." Violet sat down on the top step and looked up at her mother. "He lives 7 miles northwest. He has been coming to help with the fence and the roof. You have met him." "The quiet one," Rosa said. "With the gray eyes." "Yes." Rosa was silent for a moment. Then she said, "He paid the whole amount. He sold his breeding bull at auction this afternoon. The full proceeds went to the bank this morning before the sale." Rosa looked at her daughter for a very long time. The lamp between them cast a warm, unsteady light. Beyond the porch the desert was dark and full of the sounds of things moving. "Violet," she said finally, "what does this man want?" "Nothing," Violet said, and then, more honestly, "he wants to come to supper on Sunday. He wants to be invited into this family's life. He wants—" She stopped and started again. "I think he wants to know me. That is what I believe." Rosa Zavala looked out at the dark desert and was quiet for a long moment. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was thinking through things in that methodical way of hers, processing and ordering and arriving at conclusions. "He is a good man," she said at last. It was a statement, not a question. "I believe he is." "You are sure about this?" "I am not sure about anything. But I think he is the kind of man who does what he says and means what he does. I think he is honest. I think he is." She paused. "I think he is lonely, the way I have been lonely." Rosa reached down and put her hand over her daughter's hand where it rested on the porch boards. A small, firm gesture. A gesture that said several things at once without saying any of them. "Tell him to come for supper on Sunday," she said. "I will make tamales." Marco appeared in the doorway behind them, 16 and lanky, and pretending he had not been eavesdropping. "Did someone say tamales?" he said. "Go to bed, Marco," Rosa said. "Who paid the debt?" Marco asked. "Bed," Rosa repeated. Marco retreated with the expression of someone filing away information for later interrogation. Violet smiled at her mother, and her mother smiled back, and for a moment on that porch in the dark desert, there was nothing but the warm, ordinary quiet of a family that had stepped back from an edge. The trouble with Cornelius Fitch arrived, as Violet had predicted it would, swiftly and without ceremony. He appeared at the farm on the 11th of October, 3 days after the auction and 2 days before Sunday's supper, which meant that Violet had to manage this confrontation without Isaac present, which she suspected was intentional timing on Fitch's part. He arrived in his carriage, which was the kind of statement a man made when he wanted to communicate wealth and consequence. Cornelius Fitch was 53 years old, with the particular prosperity that came from being a banker in a territory where credit was scarce and collateral was plentiful. He was not a physically threatening man. He was well-dressed and soft-spoken and precise in his movements, which made him more dangerous than a physically threatening man, in Violet's estimation. He wore his power quietly, the way a trap is quiet until the mechanism fires. Violet was in the kitchen garden when he came through the gate. She straightened and watched him approach with her hands at her sides. "Miss Zavala," he said, with a courteous nod that contained something else entirely beneath it. "Mr. Fitch." She did not offer her hand. I wanted to come in person, he said, to acknowledge the resolution of your family's mortgage situation. A considerable sum raised apparently very quickly. He paused. By a neighbor. The debt has been settled, she said. I believe you received confirmation from your own bank. I did. He looked around the property with an appraiser's eye, taking in the mended fence, the repaired roof, the general evidence of recent labor. I confess I was surprised. I had not been aware that Mr. Aldridge was a man of such generous impulses. He is a man of good character, she said. Fitch smiled in a way that did not involve warmth. I am sure he is. I wonder, though, whether he has considered that his generous impulse may create complications for him. What kind of complications? Well, Fitch said, adjusting his coat. The water rights on the northern section of his property are a matter I have been meaning to address. There are some questions about the original deed documentation that my office has recently begun reviewing. These things can become quite involved. Violet looked at him steadily. The threat was unmistakable and perfectly deniable, the kind of threat only a particular type of man could deliver. The kind of man who had spent decades operating within a system that accommodated him. I see, she said. I hope you do, he said pleasantly. It would be a shame if Mr. Aldridge's good intentions resulted in difficulties for his own property. A single man, working alone, these things become complicated. He glanced at her again with that assessing look. Of course, if the family were ever to reconsider the standing offers for this property, I imagine many of these complications might resolve themselves quite naturally. The property is not for sale, Violet said. Her voice was very steady. She was furious in the contained, focused way that her mother had taught her, that pressed the fury down into something cold and useful rather than something hot and wasteful. Well, he said, I am sure you will keep all considerations in mind. He tilted his hat with that infuriating courtliness and went back to his carriage. She stood in the kitchen garden until the sound of the carriage wheels had faded completely. Then she went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and thought carefully for a very long time. She rode to Isaac's property that evening. She had never been there before. She found it in the last of the daylight, a modest and well-maintained operation with a solid adobe house and a good barn and a small herd of cattle ranging in the near pasture. The empty pasture where Titan had presumably been kept was visible from the road, and looking at it, she felt the full weight of what he had given up. He was at the fence near the barn when she arrived, checking the line, and he turned at the sound of her horse with an expression that shifted immediately when he saw her face. What happened? He said. She told him about Fitch. All of it, precisely and completely. Isaac listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The water rights claim, he said. That is not a new concern. I have the original deed documentation and the water rights are clearly established. He knows that. He is not actually threatening a legal proceeding, Violet said. He is threatening the process, the inconvenience, the cost of defending the documentation even when you are clearly in the right. That is how he operates. Yes, Isaac said, I understand. I should have warned you, she said. I told you he would be difficult and I did not tell you how difficult. You told me enough. He leaned against the fence and looked out at the pasture, thinking. He wants your family's land. He wants it to extend his holdings along the southern road. Our property is the gap in what would otherwise be a contiguous parcel he has been building for several years. Without our acreage, the parcel is less valuable. With it, he controls both sides of the road through to the southern grazing lands. That is significant. Yes. And he is willing to use whatever leverage is available to him to get it. He has been doing exactly that for 8 months. She paused. He is also connected to the territorial judge in Maricopa County and to several members of the county land office. Isaac absorbed this. She watched him process it with that deliberate thoroughness of his, turning it in his mind the way a man turns a piece of machinery to understand its function. "There are things I can do," he said. "Legal things. I have a friend in Tucson, a man named Harlan Gaines who practices law. He is good and he is honest, which are not always the same thing in this territory. I can speak to him about establishing the water rights documentation formally, which creates a public record that is harder to challenge. And I know 2 other ranchers in the area who have had difficulty with Fitch's practices. A collective account to the Territorial Land Commissioner carries more weight than an individual complaint." Violet looked at him. He was already solving it. He had heard the problem, and his mind had gone immediately to the practical, to the available tools, to the next move. It was not a cavalier response. He understood the seriousness. He was simply constitutionally incapable of responding to a threat with anything other than purposeful action. "Why are you not afraid?" she asked. He considered this. "I did not say I was not afraid," he said. "I am concerned about my water rights and I do not welcome complications with the land office. But I am not going to allow a man like Fitch to proceed unchallenged because he hopes I will be too overwhelmed to push back." He looked at her. "I have lived alone in this desert for 2 years. I have built this operation by myself. I am not afraid of hard work or of a long process." She looked at him in the fading light. This lean, quiet man with his practical mind and his steady gray eyes and his complete absence of theatrical heroism. There was nothing grand in what he was saying. He was not declaring war on Fitch or making promises he could not keep. He was describing, in plain language, what he was going to do. She found it the most reassuring thing anyone had said to her in 14 months. "All right," she said. "Then let us decide together what we are going to do." They stood at his fence for another hour, talking through it, and she told him everything she knew about Fitch's history and methods, and he told her what he understood about the legal mechanisms available. And by the time she rode home in the full dark, she felt, for the second time in 4 days, something settling in her chest that she cautiously identified as the sensation of not being alone. Sunday came with the particular golden quality of October mornings in Arizona. The sky a deep crystalline blue and the air still cool from the night, the smell of the desert and the warmth beginning at the edges of things. Rosa Zavala had been cooking since before dawn. Violet set the table with the good tablecloth, the one her mother brought out for important occasions. The white cotton embroidered along the edges with small blue flowers in a pattern Rosa had learned from her own mother. Marco had been enlisted to carry wood and sweep the porch, and had done both without complaint, which indicated that he was as curious about Isaac Aldridge as he was pretending not to be. Isaac arrived precisely when he said he would, at noon, with his horse properly groomed and himself in a clean white shirt and his good hat. And he carried a paper parcel that turned out to contain coffee, which he handed to Rosa with a gravity that made her assess him with narrowed eyes before accepting it. Rosa asked about Missouri. Isaac described it briefly and accurately. She asked about his parents, and he said his father had died when he was 22, and his mother had gone to live with his sister in Kansas City, and that he wrote to them regularly. Rosa nodded at this information and moved on. She asked about his faith, and he was honest about his irregular attendance, and Rosa said that the Lord was patient, but that a man with a family needed to be present for it, and he agreed that this was reasonable. Violet, across the table, absorbed the phrase "a man with a family" and looked at her plate. She asked about his land and his cattle and his plans, and he answered everything carefully, describing the setback that Titan's sale represented, and his intentions for rebuilding the breeding program over the following 2 years, which required a small loan or a partnership with another rancher, and both options had complications, but neither was insurmountable. That was a considerable sacrifice, Rosa said, not accusingly, carefully. Yes, Isaac said. Rosa looked at him for a moment, then she said, "My husband would have liked you." It was the highest compliment she had available. After dinner, Marco showed Isaac the repair work on the south fence, which gave Violet and her mother a few minutes alone in the kitchen with the dishes. "Well," Rosa said. "Well," Violet agreed. "He is a serious man." Rosa handed her a plate to dry. "Serious and steady, not flashy. Not full of speeches." "No, good." Rosa handed her another plate. "Flashy men are all performance and no foundation. Your father was a serious man. Serious men do not leave." Violet dried the plate and set it carefully in the rack. "It is early," she said. "Nothing has been decided." "Things are always decided before they are officially decided," Rosa said. This was so precisely true that Violet had no response. When Isaac left in the late afternoon, he walked with Violet to the gate, and they stood there for a moment with the long Arizona shadows falling and the light very gold. "Your mother approves of me," he said. He sounded mildly surprised. "She told you that my husband would have liked you," Violet said. "That means she has already made her decision." She said my husband, your husband. She meant my father. Violet looked at him and felt warmth moving through her. "She does that sometimes, slips the tense." She paused. "She is thinking about the future." He looked at her steadily. Then he said carefully, "So am I." The weeks that followed were structured around 3 things simultaneously: the legal process of formalizing the water rights documentation, the practical management of both their properties, and the slow, deliberate unfolding of what was growing between them. Harlan Gaines, Isaac's lawyer in Tucson, was indeed both good and honest, a compact, energetic man in his 40s who had a particular dislike of Cornelius Fitch that he kept professionally contained, but was visible around the edges. He reviewed Isaac's deed documentation and confirmed the water rights were solid, drafted a formal registration with the county land office, and made contact with 2 other ranchers, the Whitmore brothers who ran cattle north of Tucson and a widow named Margaret Ellery who had a small horse operation to the east, both of whom had specific and documented grievances against Fitch's practices. Gaines presented the collective account to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in November, accompanied by affidavits from all 4 parties. It was not a lawsuit. It was a formal complaint, clearly documented, requesting an investigation into patterns of deed pressure and improper mortgage handling. This kind of thing moved slowly. Violet knew it would move slowly. Isaac knew it too. They were prepared to be patient, which was fortunate because patience was what was required. Fitch made 2 more approaches. A letter to Violet in late October that reiterated the standing offer for the property with a slightly higher number, which she did not respond to. "You documented it," Violet said. "Gaines said to document everything," Isaac said. "He is right." She paused. "Are you certain you are all right, that kind of conversation with that kind of man?" "I have been handling difficult men since I was 20 years old," Isaac said. "It is not comfortable, but I know what to do with it." She believed him. She had been watching him for 6 weeks now, and she understood something fundamental about Isaac Aldridge, which was that he was not reckless and not fearless, but that he had a particular quality she could only call grounded. He was not easily moved from his position by external pressure. He had thought through his position carefully before taking it, and he trusted his own reasoning, and he held his ground. It was, she had decided, the most attractive quality she had encountered in another person. In November, he asked if she would like to ride with him to see the property line on the northern section of his land, the area where the water rights in question originated. And she said yes, and they rode out there on a crisp, clear morning with the desert smelling of sage and cold, and the mountains blue in the distance. He showed her the spring, a modest and reliable thing emerging from the rock with no drama, and explained the irrigation channels he had built. And she listened and asked questions, and they talked for 2 hours about water and land and the management of both, and she thought, not for the first time, that she could talk to this man about anything. On the way back, in a narrow canyon where the red rock walls rose on both sides and the light came in a vertical column, he pulled up his horse and she pulled up hers, and they looked at each other. And then he said, without preamble, "I would like to court you properly." She had been expecting something like this for 3 weeks and was still not entirely prepared for the directness of it. "Properly," she said, "with your mother's knowledge, with intention stated, not just as a neighbor who comes to supper." She looked at him in the red canyon light. His horse stood still. He was watching her with that steady gaze that never demanded anything and never flinched. "I think that is already understood," she said, "by everyone involved." "I want it to be explicit," he said. "I do not want there to be any confusion about what I am and what I want." "And what do you want?" She asked it quietly, not as a challenge but as a genuine question, because she wanted to hear him say it. He looked at her for a long moment. "I want to build something that lasts," he said. "I want to stop being alone. I want—" He stopped briefly, and she saw him reach for the words the way a man reaches for something on a high shelf. "I want to come home to something real. I have been working towards something for 2 years, and I realized not long ago that I had been working toward it without understanding what the center of it was supposed to be. What is the point of building something stable and good if there is no one to share it with?" He paused again. "That is what I want, and I think you know I am talking about you specifically and not abstractly." Violet sat very still on her horse in the red canyon. The light was very clear. She could feel her heart beat. "I want those things too," she said. "I have been wanting them for longer than I had a context for them, and I think—" she took a breath. "I think I love you. I think it has been happening since at least the fence post." The thing that moved across his face then was not small. It was profound and quiet, and it changed his expression in a way she had not seen before. A kind of opening, a warmth that came from somewhere deep and unguarded. And she understood in that moment that this was not a man who was going to make declarations easily or often. And that made this one count more. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "I love you," he said. Just those 3 words, plain and direct, without decoration. The most Isaac Aldridge way of saying the most important thing. She held his hand in the red canyon with the light coming straight down, and felt something complete and settle inside her that she had been missing for a very long time. They went back to her mother's house and told Rosa, who listened to all of it with a still face and then stood and embraced Isaac, which surprised him visibly, and said something to him in Spanish that Violet translated as something close to "you had better be worthy of her," and he said, very seriously, "I intend to spend considerable time making sure that I am." Rosa wiped her eyes and told them supper was in an hour and went back into the kitchen. Marco, appearing from behind a convenient doorframe, said, "I knew it," and Violet threw a dishcloth at him. December brought cold nights and clear days, and the particular quality of Arizona winter that was nothing like winter in Missouri, but was still beautiful, Isaac said, in its own way. He came to the Zavala farm 3 times a week, which had become understood by everyone as the natural pattern of things. He brought firewood from the cutting he had done on his property. He helped Marco with a water trough repair that had been on the list since September. He sat at the table in the evenings and drank coffee, and talked with Rosa about plants, and about the territory, and about the news from the eastern cities, which Rosa followed in the Tucson newspaper with a critical interest. He and Violet walked in the evenings when the temperature allowed it, which in December was most evenings, wrapped in coats and talking about everything, the practical and the personal and the imagined future. She told him about her father, who had been a man of tremendous warmth and unreliable judgment in financial matters, who had loved the land and his family with equal fierceness, and had died of a fever at 54, still believing that the following spring would be the one that turned everything around. She told him about the 14 months of managing grief and crisis together, about the strange intimacy of shared difficulty, about what it had done to her understanding of what she needed in another person. "Were you ever close to giving up on it?" she asked one evening, walking the road between her property and the edge of the desert. "There were a few months in the first winter," he said. "The house needed more work than I had understood, and the cattle I started with were not quality, and I had a sense that I was further from what I was trying to build than I had thought." He was quiet for a moment. "But I do not give up on things I have decided on. It is a quality that has both served me and caused me difficulty. I have noticed that quality," she said. "I appreciate it, even when it means I make decisions without consulting the people they affect." She looked at him sideways. "You are still apologizing for Titan." "I think I will always feel some responsibility about the manner of it, not the action, but the manner. I know." She touched his arm briefly. "I have accepted the manner. I understand why you did it the way you did. I still would have said no. I know. Which means you were right to not ask, if the goal was to actually help rather than to ask and be refused." "That is a complicated kind of being right," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "but it is the kind we have to live with." He caught her hand and held it as they walked, and she let her head rest against his shoulder briefly, because the evening was cold and he was warm, and this was a thing she had been allowed to do now, this ordinary and extraordinary thing. The news from the Territorial Land Commissioner's office came in January. Gaines sent word by messenger that the investigation into Fitch's practices had been opened formally. This did not mean it was resolved. It meant it existed on the official record, and that Fitch was now under scrutiny, which was a different kind of pressure than he was accustomed to. Gaines was cautiously optimistic that the combination of documented complaints and the water rights registration had significantly limited Fitch's ability to maneuver against either the Zavala property or Isaac's holdings. "It is not over," Violet told Isaac when he arrived that evening. "No. But it is shifted." He sat down at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee Rosa set in front of him with a nod of thanks. "The investigation creates a record. Any action he takes now is visible in a way it was not before. He will be more careful," she said. "Yes." "Which is itself a form of limitation." Rosa sat down across from Isaac. She had been listening with the expression she wore when she was calculating. "He will not try anything direct again," she said. "Men like that do not take risks when they are being watched. They wait for a better opportunity." "Yes," Isaac said, "which means we need to make sure that opportunity does not come." "How?" Marco asked from the other side of the table. He had become a full participant in these conversations over the past 2 months, his instincts sharp and his understanding of the situation as clear as anyone's. "2 things," Isaac said. "First, the property needs to be in strong productive use. A productive farm that is clearly managing well is a harder target than one that is visibly struggling. Second, Violet and I need to." He stopped and looked at Violet with a slight shift in his expression. "Need to what?" Marco said. "We have been talking," Violet said carefully, about our future plans. Rosa looked between them. Her face was still, but her eyes were not. We have discussed the possibility, Isaac said, meeting Rosa's eyes directly, of marriage. I wanted to speak with you before anything was decided. The kitchen was very quiet. Rosa looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Violet. Violet held her mother's gaze without looking away. You want to marry my daughter, Rosa said. Yes, Isaac said, if she will have me and with your blessing. Rosa was quiet again. She was working through it with that methodical thoroughness of hers. All the implications, all the complications, all the things it would mean. Tell me, she said finally to Isaac. What will happen to this farm, to Marco, to me? Nothing changes for this farm, he said. It is Violet's home and her mother's home, and it will remain that. I have 40 acres of my own and my own house and my own operation, but this farm does not disappear because Violet and I marry. If anything, I would like to invest time in improving it. Marco will come into a stronger property than the one he would inherit otherwise. Rosa looked at him. You would not take her away from us. No, you would not expect her to abandon her family's land. No, that land is part of her. It would be part of us. Marco was very quiet across the table, and Violet could see that he was working hard to maintain the expression of a young man who was entirely composed, which told her that he was not entirely composed. Rosa looked down at her coffee cup. Then she looked up at Violet. And Violet saw in her mother's eyes the grief that lived alongside the happiness. The memory of the man who should have been sitting at this table to give or withhold his blessing. The absence that shaped everything. The presence of her father in the very conversation about his absence. He would have liked you, Rosa said to Isaac again. The same thing she had said that first Sunday, but the meaning was different now. I am glad to hear that, Isaac said quietly. Then you have my blessing, Rosa said. You have it completely. Marco made a sound that was not quite a word and stood up and walked out to the porch without explanation. And Violet heard him out there making the kinds of sounds a 16-year-old boy makes when he is trying not to show that something has moved him. She looked at Isaac across the table and he looked at her. And in his eyes, she saw the same thing she felt, which was the particular quality of happiness that has come through difficulty, the kind that knows its own weight. They were married in February of 1883, on the 14th, which Violet's mother said was a good day for it. The ceremony was at the small church in Tucson, attended by Rosa and Marco and Harlan Gaines and his wife and the Whitmore brothers and Margaret Ellery, and a selection of neighbors who had watched the Zavala family weather the last 14 months and were glad to celebrate something going right. Isaac wore his good clothes and stood at the altar with a stillness that she had come to understand as his form of the deepest feeling. She walked up the aisle on Marco's arm because Marco had asked if he could, and she had said yes without hesitation. And she saw Isaac's face when he saw her, and she thought that she would remember that expression for the rest of her life. The careful, contained, overwhelmed face of a man seeing the thing he had been working toward and had not been entirely sure he deserved. She had worn her mother's wedding dress, let out slightly at the waist and taken in at the shoulders, ivory cotton with small buttons all the way down the back that had taken Rosa and Mrs. Cortez 45 minutes to fasten that morning. She had flowers in her hair from the small garden by the porch, pale yellow things that bloomed in February in Arizona, because Arizona had its own rules about seasons. The vows were traditional. They said them clearly, both of them, looking at each other, and when he put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that he had ordered from a jeweler in Tucson, she felt the solidity of it like an anchor. Afterward there was food at the Zavala farmhouse, Rosa having cooked for 2 days. The table crowded with people and food and the particular noise of celebration in a small community where good news was worth sharing. Isaac stood at the edge of it with a glass of cider and watched the room with an expression that was quieter than happiness but more lasting. Violet found him there and stood beside him. "How are you?" she said. "Overwhelmed in the best possible way," he said. She laughed and took his hand. "You are not very good at celebrations." "I am getting better," he said. "You have the whole rest of your life to practice." He looked at her. That look, the one she was now able to read completely. "I intend to make good use of the time," he said. The spring of 1883 brought rain, which was not guaranteed in the territory, and the rain meant a better planting season than the previous 2 years. And the planting season meant work that involved both properties and most of the family. Isaac had acquired a new breeding bull through the partnership he had arranged with the Whitmore brothers. A younger animal without Titan's proven record, but with good conformation and good bloodlines, whom Marco named Hercules on the grounds that all great bulls deserved great names. Violet had always had a particular talent for growing things, which she had inherited from her father and refined through necessity. And the vegetable garden that season was the largest and best managed it had ever been. She expanded the kitchen garden to the east, adding a section for medicinal herbs that she had been wanting to establish for 2 years, and Rosa taught her 3 new preservation methods that Violet then taught to Mrs. Cortez, who taught them to her daughter-in-law. And this was the way knowledge moved in the territory, hand to hand and season to season. Isaac had been right about what their combined management could do for both properties. The Zavala farm's fence lines were sound, and the water systems were maintained, and the outbuildings were in repair in a way they had not been since before Alejandro Zavala's death. Marco, who had turned 17 in December, was developing into a genuinely skilled horseman and was learning cattle management from Isaac with the thoroughness of a person who has found the thing they are meant to do. In April, Gaines sent word that the territorial investigation into Fitch's practices had resulted in a formal censure from the Land Commissioner's office and a requirement for third-party audit of mortgage documents held by the First Territorial Bank. It did not destroy Fitch. It did not put him in prison, but it clipped his ability to operate in the gray areas he had depended on, and 3 of his pending foreclosure actions were reviewed, and 2 were reversed. He did not approach Violet or Isaac again. He was still in Tucson, still a banker, still a man of influence. But the shape of his influence had changed, and his interest in the Zavala property appeared, at last, to have cooled. Violet heard this news from Harlan Gaines directly, who stopped by the farm one morning in April to deliver it in person because he was, he said, particular about good news being delivered face to face. "Is it over?" she asked. "I would not say over," Gaines said carefully, "but significantly reduced. He has other concerns now. He has been made to understand that this particular territory of interest is not going to be as manageable as he had hoped." "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Gaines shook his head. "I only did the paperwork," he said. "Your husband did the refusing to be intimidated, and you did the surviving long enough for there to be something worth protecting." She thought about that for a long time after he left. The first pregnancy arrived in the summer of 1883, which they had been hoping for and were still surprised by. The way you can hope for something and still be surprised when it arrives. Violet told Isaac on a Tuesday evening in July, sitting on the porch of their house, which was Isaac's original adobe, but had been significantly expanded and improved over the preceding months to accommodate the possibility of children and the actual presence of 2 adults who both had strong opinions about where things should go. She simply said, "I am going to have a baby." He went very still. Then he turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before and could not entirely describe. It was not the contained warmth of his everyday feeling or the careful restraint of his daily manner. It was something unguarded and enormous and brief. A flash of the interior of a person who had been alone for 2 years by choice, and for years before that by circumstance, who had built walls and routines and methods against the particular cold of solitude, and who was now looking at the evidence of a future that was entirely different from the one he had expected. He said, "Are you all right?" She smiled at him. "I am very well," she said. "Are you all right?" He put his hand over hers on the porch rail. He did not say anything else for a moment. Then he said, "I had not expected to feel like this. What does it feel like?" He thought about it with his usual careful honesty. "Like the most important thing I have ever done," he said, "which is strange because all I have done is received information. You will do considerably more," she assured him. He laughed, which was a sound she had been collecting for months, rarer and therefore more valuable. Rosa received the news with a stillness that lasted approximately 4 seconds before she burst into tears of a completely different quality from her usual quiet ones. Marco whooped and then looked embarrassed about whooping. Mrs. Cortez, who happened to be present, said something fervent in Spanish that she declined to translate, but that was clearly congratulatory. The baby arrived in March of 1884, which everyone agreed was a good month for it. He was born in the farmhouse, with Rosa and the Tucson midwife, Mrs. Delgado, attending, and Isaac in the front room listening with an intensity that Violet's mother said had aged him visibly. He was a boy, broad-shouldered and immediately opinionated, with his father's coloring and his mother's eyes and a set of lungs that the midwife said were the finest advertisement for good health she had encountered. They named him Alejandro James Aldridge. Alejandro for her father, James for Isaac's. Rosa held him for a long time that first afternoon and called him Alejandro under her breath and was very still. And Violet watched her mother and understood that this was a different kind of grief and a different kind of healing. The way new life can be both its own thing and a salute to what came before. Isaac held his son for the first time with an expression of pure, focused terror that gradually, over the course of about 10 minutes, shifted into something she could only call wonder. He sat in the chair by the window with the baby against his chest and looked at the small face with an attention that was entirely characteristic of him. The thorough observation of a man who was learning something new and taking it seriously. "Hello," he said to the baby quietly, as if introducing himself. Alejandro regarded him with the unfocused gravity of newborns. "You look very serious," Isaac said. "That is promising." Violet, watching from the bed, felt something so full and warm in her chest that it was almost pain. Marco took his role as uncle with tremendous seriousness and some inexperience, learning to hold the baby with the careful intensity of someone who has been entrusted with something irreplaceable and is determined not to break it. By the time Alejandro was 3 months old, Marco could manage a feeding and a changing, and had developed strong opinions about which lullabies were effective, which was one that his father used to sing, and which Marco sang slightly off-key, but with great conviction. The years that followed moved with the quality of years lived well, not without difficulty, but with the kind of difficulty that is managed together, which is a different experience entirely. The cattle operation grew. Hercules proved himself a worthy successor to Titan's bloodline. Marco took over the primary management of the Zavala farm at 18 and proved entirely capable of it. Rosa Zavala aged with grace and authority and continued to make the best tamales in the county, which was a widely held and rarely contested opinion. Isaac and Violet had their second child in the spring of 1886, a girl they named Clara Rosa, who arrived in April with her father's coloring and her grandmother's temperament, which meant she was observant and quiet and absolutely immovable once she had made up her mind. Rosa held Clara with a satisfaction that was different from the joy she had felt with Alejandro, deeper and stiller, the satisfaction of seeing herself reflected and continued. Alejandro, 2 years old, regarded his sister with the suspicious assessment of a child determining whether this development was beneficial to him or not. He decided, after about a week, that it was, primarily because Clara was an excellent audience and he was developing a performer's instinct. Their farm, the combined and overlapping operations of the two adjacent properties, was one of the stronger enterprises in the county by 1886. Isaac had rebuilt the breeding program to a quality that approached what Titan had represented, which had taken 3 years of patience and careful work. He had never stopped feeling the absence of the bull. Violet knew it. She could see it in the way he looked at the pasture sometimes, with a particular expression she had learned to recognize and never to address directly, because it was not a wound that needed attention, only one that needed to be allowed to exist. One afternoon in October of 1886, 4 years after the auction that had started everything, they were riding the fence line of Isaac's north pasture. Alejandro was with Rosa at the farmhouse. Clara was asleep in the carrier on Violet's back, because Clara slept well in motion and not well in any other condition. They stopped at the northern section, near the spring where the water rights had once been under threat, and looked out at the land in the late afternoon light. "I have been thinking," Isaac said. "You are always thinking," she said. "That is your primary activity." "I have been thinking about whether I have built the thing I came here to build." She looked at him. He was looking at the land with that particular quality of attention he gave to things he was trying to see clearly. His hat brim shadowed his face, but she could see his profile, and the set of his jaw, and all the things she had learned to read in the 4 years of watching him with love. And she said, "I think the thing I came here to build was not what I thought it was," he said. "I thought I came here to build a cattle operation, something stable and mine and productive." He paused. "That is part of it, but it is not the center of it." "What is the center of it?" He turned to look at her. Clara was a warm weight against her back, breathing the slow, deep breath of a sleeping baby, and the light was gold on everything, and Isaac Aldridge looked at her with those steady gray eyes that had become the most familiar thing in her life. "You are," he said. "And the children, and your mother and Marco, and the particular shape of all of this. The table on Sunday evenings and the sound of the morning when we get up, and the way the farm looks in the rain, and the argument we had about the kitchen shelf that I am still not sure I was wrong about." "You were wrong about the shelf," she said. "I will revisit my position on the shelf," he said. "But that is beside the point." She was smiling and could not help it and did not want to. Clara shifted slightly in the carrier and made a small sound and then settled again. "I want to tell you something," Violet said. "All right. When I rode to that auction yard 4 years ago," she said, "I was furious. I have told you that. I was furious at you for presuming and for not asking and for making a decision that affected my family without consulting me." She paused. "But I was also terrified." "Terrified of what?" "Of what it meant. Of you. Of the fact that something had already happened between us that I had been trying to manage very carefully, and suddenly there was this enormous gesture that made the management impossible." She looked at him steadily. "I had been protecting myself, very efficiently, I thought, and then you sold your bull." He was watching her quietly. "And I had to accept," she said, "that there was no protection against a man who simply does the thing." who sees the problem and solves it without performance and without asking for credit. That is a thing you cannot defend against, Isaac. That is the kind of thing that gets through every guard. He reached across the space between their horses and put his hand against her face briefly, his palm warm against her cheek. "I was not trying to get through your guard," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what made it so effective." The sun was dropping toward the mountains. The spring made its small, constant sound below them. Clara breathed against her back. Hercules could be seen in the far pasture, large and unhurried, the future of the operation moving on its 4 solid legs through the late afternoon grass. "I would like," Isaac said slowly, "to write to a man in Texas. A rancher I have heard about from the Whitmore brothers. He has a red bull of exceptional quality that he is considering selling. I looked into the bloodline when I heard about it. It is related to Titan's line." Violet looked at him. Something moved in her chest. "You want to get another Titan," she said. "Not another Titan," he said. "There was only one Titan, but something that continues what he represented." He paused. "I did not let myself think about it for a long time. It felt disloyal to Titan, to what that animal meant and what I gave him for." He was quiet for a moment. "But I think now that the way to honor what that sacrifice meant is to build something from it, not just to carry the absence." She thought about her father, about how she had understood his absence for a long time as only a wound, and then as also a continuing presence. The tamale recipe, Marco's way of moving when he thought no one was watching, the farm itself. "Write the letter," she said. He nodded once with the decisive quality he had when something had been decided. "We should get back," he said. "Your mother will have supper." "She will have been insulted by Alejandro attempting to help cook," Violet said. "Again. He is very determined for a 2-year-old. He gets that from his father." They turned their horses and rode back toward the farmhouse, toward the smoke rising from the chimney and the sound of Marco's off-key singing drifting from the barn, and the light in the kitchen window that meant Rosa had lit the lamp. The desert settled into its evening colors around them, copper and gold and the deepening purple of the shadows, and the mountains went from blue to dark blue to the first pale glitter of a star appearing above them. This was their life. This specific and ordinary and extraordinary life, built from a fence post snagged on a nail and a bank letter in an apron pocket, and one generous, devastating, irreversible decision made by a quiet man with steady eyes. Built from all the things they had each carried alone, before they understood that carrying things alone was a choice and not a condition. Built from 40 acres and the Zavala farm, and a spring that produced reliable water, and a bull that had been traded for something worth more than cattle and prize money, and the slow accumulation of property. Built from love, which had come slowly and completely and which did not announce itself, but had simply one day been present, the way the desert is present, the way the sky is present, the way the things that are most true are present without requiring explanation or defense. The baby stirred against Violet's back and made a sound of waking, not a cry, just the small affirmation of a person returning from sleep to find herself in motion and warm and carried. Isaac heard it and looked over and then looked at Violet with that expression she had been collecting for 4 years. The one she planned to keep collecting for all the years ahead of them. The one that was more than happiness and less than words. The particular face of a man who knows exactly where he is and exactly how he got there and is quietly, unshakably, completely grateful for it. The letter to the Texas rancher went out the following week. The response came back in 3 weeks, describing a young bull of excellent quality from a bloodline that any cattleman in the territory would have recognized and respected. The price was negotiable. Isaac showed Violet the letter at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning in November with Alejandro on his lap, and Clara in Rosa's arms and Marco, drinking coffee across from them, with the self-possessed manner of a young man who had taken on his responsibilities and worn them easily. "What do you think?" Isaac said. She read the letter. She considered the price, which was manageable given the season's returns. She thought about Titan being led away through the dust of the auction yard, and the envelope of money and all the distance between that afternoon and this one. "I think," she said, "that Alejandro will need to help name him." Alejandro, who had been waiting for any opportunity to contribute, said horse, which was his current answer to most questions. "Not a horse," Isaac said gravely. "A bull." "Big horse," Alejandro said, apparently willing to revise. Marco laughed. Rosa laughed. The kitchen filled with the particular sound of a family in the morning, ordinary and warm and lit with the certainty of itself. Isaac wrote back to Texas that afternoon. The new bull arrived in December, just before Christmas, led off a railroad car at the Tucson station by a drover who knew his business. A deep red animal with broad shoulders, and the particular quality of absolute calm that was the hallmark of good breeding. Isaac stood at the station fence and looked at him for a long time. He did not look like Titan. He looked like himself, which was right. Every animal had its own character, its own particular presence. Isaac understood this and was glad of it. He did not want a replica. He wanted a continuation. Marco was at the station with him, having driven the wagon for the transport. He stood beside Isaac and looked at the bull with the evaluating eye he had been developing for 3 years. "He is something," Marco said. "He is," Isaac agreed. "What are we going to call him?" Isaac had been thinking about this. He had asked Violet, and she had said it was his decision, and he had asked Alejandro, who had said big horse, and he had thought about it in the quiet of the evenings for the past 2 weeks. Alejandro chose his name, Isaac said. Marco looked at him. "Big horse," Isaac said. "In Spanish, Caballo Grand, but we will call him Grand." Marco considered this for a moment, and then he smiled, and it was a smile that contained several things. The memory of a small boy's enthusiastic mispronunciation, and the recognition that someone had taken that enthusiasm seriously, and the particular pleasure of a moment being honored correctly. "Grand," Marco agreed. "He looks like a grand." They loaded the bull onto the wagon with the careful management of animals that know their own power and need to be persuaded rather than forced, and drove the 7 miles back through the December cold with the mountains white capped in the distance, and the road empty and the territory quiet around them. Violet was at the gate when they arrived, wrapped in her coat with Clara on her hip, because she had known when they would be back and had wanted to see. Alejandro was beside her, holding her skirt, trying to get a view of the wagon. Isaac brought the wagon in through the gate and climbed down and went to help Marco with Grand's lead rope. The bull descended from the wagon with deliberate dignity and stood in the yard and regarded everything with calm interest. Alejandro, having spent 2 weeks telling anyone who would listen about the big horse that was coming, stood very still for a moment at the sight of the actual animal. "Big," he said. "Yes," Violet said. "Very big." "Also yes," Isaac said, coming to stand beside his family. Alejandro looked up at his father with the expression of a child encountering wonder for the first time on a scale they had not anticipated. "Ours," he said. Isaac looked at Violet. She was watching him with those dark eyes, with the look he knew, the one he had been the subject of for 4 years, the one that saw him clearly and loved what it saw, and he felt the full quiet weight of his own life and found it exactly right. "Ours," he said. Marco led Gran to the pasture. Rosa came out of the house with coffee and insisted everyone come inside before they froze. The December sun went on being cold and clear over the Arizona desert. The mountains stood as they always stood. The spring on the north property continued its small, reliable work. And the Aldrich family went inside out of the cold, all of them together, into the warm and ordinary miracle of their one shared life.